school, when he spent time with Diana Ross with The Wiz, he always had this admiration for Diana Ross when he was young. I think it got to a point where he really loved her and he really liked her, still to this day.
There is a man who grew up inside the most powerful music empire in American history. A man who sat in those recording studios as a child, watched legends record in the next room, and witnessed things that were never meant to be seen. A man who married into the family that owned it all, and then walked away carrying secrets that have haunted him for decades. That man is Jermaine Jackson. And before he left Motown, he said something that stopped the entire industry cold. He looked around at the people he called family, singers, producers, the architects of a golden era, and he said, "Not all of us are human. Some are demons disguised as singers." He then named 10 people, 10 artists who laughed with him, hugged him in the hallways of Hitsville, toasted champagne at birthday parties. And according to Jermaine, those were the very same people behind the betrayals, the destroyed careers, the mysterious deaths, and the soul trading that kept the Motown machine running. Stay with us, because today we are opening every single one of those files, one name at a time. And by the time we reach the last name on that list, a name that will shake you to your core, you are going to understand why Jermaine Jackson said what he said and why he waited so long to say it. Are you ready? Because once you hear this, you cannot unhear it. The night Motown's innocence died, Diana Ross. Let's go back to a specific night, not a rumor, not a theory, a night with a date, a location, and a witness. July 29th, 1967, Studio A, Hitsville, USA, Detroit, Michigan. This was the room where history was made, the room where the sound of a generation was born, the room where black artists proved to the world that they could reach any height, any stage, any dream. But on this particular night, that dream was being buried. Jermaine Jackson was 13 years old. His father had brought him and his brothers to Hitsville because the Jackson 5 were preparing for a trial performance contract. Jermaine was young, but he was observant, and what he saw that night would stay with him for the rest of his life. When he arrived, the air inside the studio felt wrong, quiet in the way that a room feels quiet after something terrible has just happened, tense, cold. He noticed Florence Ballard, the founder, the original heartbeat of the Supremes, walking out of the building. Her eyes were swollen. Her coat was slipping off her shoulder. She wasn't being escorted. She was being discarded. Inside, on Berry Gordy's desk, lay a freshly printed contract. The name on it? Diana Ross and the Supremes. Not the Supremes, not Florence, Mary, and Diana. Just Diana. And Diana herself was in the studio. Not singing, not rehearsing. She was standing in front of a promotional poster showing all 3 women, Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and herself, side by side, equal, together. Jermaine watched as Diana reached into her pocket, pulled out a black marker, walked to that poster, and drew a bold, deliberate X over Florence Ballard's face. The room went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Diana straightened her dress, told her assistant the session was postponed until the new group is ready, and walked out. That night, Florence Ballard was fired. Now here is the question you need to sit with. How does a woman who co-founded a group, who gave her voice and her soul to build something from nothing, end up erased from it with a single stroke of a marker? Jermaine called that moment the first crack in Motown, because the Supremes had meant something. They weren't just a hit machine. They were a symbol of unity, of sisterhood, of what black women could achieve together on a stage that had never welcomed them before. And in one night, Diana Ross turned that symbol into a personal throne. Years later, after Jermaine had married Hazel Gordy, Berry Gordy's own daughter,
Hazel Gordy, the daughter of Berry Gordy, was married to Jermaine for 15 years.
He overheard a conversation between Diana and his father-in-law at a Beverly Hills party in 1973. Diana leaned close and said softly, with the kind of calm that only comes from total certainty, "Since Florence left, Motown belongs to me." Those words froze him where he stood. Florence Ballard died on February 24, 1976, in a rundown Detroit apartment. Poverty, alcoholism, alone. The woman who helped build one of the most profitable music empires in American history died with nothing. When Jermaine heard the news, he said it felt like hearing a voice being buried alive. "Evil," Jermaine once said, "doesn't always need a knife. Sometimes it only needs a signature, a smile, and a soul willing to turn others into shadows. The man who knew every secret, Smokey Robinson. If Diana Ross was the manipulator you could see coming, then Smokey Robinson was something far more dangerous. He was the shadow you never noticed until it was too late. Jermaine didn't call Smokey evil in the conventional sense. He called him something worse. He called him Gordy's listener. Think about what that means. In any empire built on power, the most dangerous person is never the one giving the orders. It's the one collecting the information. Fall, 1969, Hitsville's Detroit headquarters. Out of nowhere, Marvin Gaye and the Temptations both had their new albums delayed simultaneously. No announcement, no explanation. The artists were kept in the dark. Then Gordy called a closed-door meeting, and inside that meeting, personal recordings were played aloud, private complaints, love letters, things that only a handful of people were supposed to know. Artists looked at each other across the table, confused, exposed, betrayed. After the meeting, a young Motown employee pulled Jermaine aside and whispered, "Smokey knows everything. He's got the keys to the archives." Smokey's method was elegant in its cruelty. He never raised his voice. He appeared at your door with a gentle smile and a voice like honey. He would sit with you, listen to you, make you feel understood. And then, quietly, everything you said would make its way back to Gordy. Whenever an artist grew restless, whenever someone started asking questions about contracts, about money, about leaving, Smokey would be summoned to have a talk. And soon after that talk, the artist's career would quietly fade. No big fallout, no dramatic firing, just silence, no new contracts, no radio play, just a slow, invisible erasure. Ask yourself this: how does a man know every secret, watch people be destroyed by those secrets, and still sleep at night? By the 1990s, after leaving Motown and becoming a minister, Smokey made a public statement that sent a chill through everyone who heard it. He said he had once lived in lies and betrayal, but he never named who he had betrayed. He never explained what he had done. Jermaine said, at Motown, his smile was the lullaby of the devil. While artists were being destroyed all around him, Smokey stood on stage bathed in spotlight, singing about love, and nobody suspected a thing. The saint who worshipped sin, Marvin Gaye. Now we reach the name that breaks your heart, because unlike the others on this list, this man wasn't evil. He was something more tragic. He was a man at war with himself, and the battlefield was his own soul. Jermaine once said, "There are people God touched, then pulled his hand away halfway, and no one in Motown bore that wound more deeply than Marvin Gaye." Summer, 1973, a wooden cabin in Topanga Canyon, California. Marvin was recording Let's Get It On. The studio was thick with incense, candles, and smoke. He called the track A Prayer of the Flesh. Standing silently behind the glass was Janice Hunter, 17 years old, watching a man nearly 2 decades older than her with eyes that were kind and dangerous at the same time. Their relationship began that night, between music and smoke. Years later, Jermaine read Marvin's personal diary, and in it, scrawled across a page, was a single line: "I pray before every sin." This was not a man without faith. This was a man who prayed constantly, who genuinely believed in God, in redemption, in the sacred power of music. But he also believed that desire was a path to the divine, and that belief destroyed him. He married Janice in 1977, by which point he was already drowning in addiction and paranoia. Janice later revealed that whenever he suspected her of infidelity, he would blast Sexual Healing at full volume through the house, not as music, but as a warning. The song the entire world heard as redemption, she heard as a threat. Jermaine once crossed paths with Marvin, leaving a locked studio at Motown Hollywood late at night. His shirt was torn, his eyes were red. In his hand was a Bible, dusted with white powder. He looked at Jermaine and said, "I just spoke with God. He told me to keep singing." On April 1st, 1984, his own birthday, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father, Reverend Marvin Gaye Sr., following a violent altercation. Later, Jermaine said he died trying to baptize himself in desire. To Jermaine, Marvin was proof of something disturbing, that when faith and lust are mixed together in the same soul, music stops being prayer. It becomes a sacrifice, and eventually, the thing being sacrificed is you. the man who owned the souls, Berry Gordy. Every empire has a king, and in Jermaine Jackson's list of 10, there was only one name he placed at the center of everything. Not the manipulator, not the spy, not the addict, the architect, Berry Gordy. Hailed across America as the visionary genius who opened the doors for black music to reach the mainstream. To the world, Gordy was the dream maker. To Jermaine Jackson, he was something else entirely. February 1973, Berry Gordy's Beverly Hills mansion, his birthday party. Outside, the street was lined with luxury cars. Inside were Motown's greatest stars, all laughing and toasting and praising the man who had given them everything. And then the night ended. The music stopped. The guests filtered out. Jermaine stayed. And he saw Gordy alone in his private office, staring at a document. He moved closer. It was a list of Motown's artists, but each name was accompanied by notations, debts owed, show counts, recording session logs. It read less like a roster of beloved artists and more like an inventory ledger. "That's when I understood," Jermaine said. "He didn't produce music, he produced souls." Motown was not a family, it was a factory. Every song, every note, every drop of sweat belonged to Gordy. Artists were locked into contracts so restrictive they couldn't take their own music elsewhere. Those who pushed back were made to disappear. Mary Wells, the woman who gave Motown its very first pop hit, was effectively banned from radio the moment she demanded ownership of her recordings. Florence Ballard died in poverty. Marvin Gaye fought for years just to release What's Going On. Whispers around Detroit for decades have described something called the Motown Circle, a secret inner group led by Gordy and trusted insiders who reportedly met once a month behind closed doors to decide which careers would rise and which would be quietly buried. "Evil doesn't dance on stage," Jermaine once said. "It signs the checks." The voice God gave and the devil claimed, David Ruffin. David Ruffin had one of the most extraordinary voices God ever placed in a human body, and he used it to destroy everything and everyone around him. 1968. The Temptations were at their peak. Ruffin demanded the group be renamed David Ruffin and the Temptations, demanded to fly separately from his own bandmates, wanted every spotlight exclusively on him. When refused, he erupted, throwing microphones, punching walls. Jermaine accompanied his father to a recording session that year and watched Ruffin arrive 3 hours late, flanked by 2 women and carrying a suitcase of cocaine. He told the room, "I am the voice of God. No one teaches me how to sing." But the real tragedy wasn't Ruffin's ego. It was what he did to Tammy Terrell, the young singer known for her duets with Marvin Gaye. Friends noticed bruises she never explained. On October 29, 1967, Tammy collapsed on stage in Philadelphia. She died in 1970 at just 24 years old. Marvin Gaye never fully believed the brain tumor diagnosis. He believed the abuse had broken something medicine couldn't see. After being fired from the Temptations, Ruffin descended into heroin addiction. There is a documented incident where, in a drug-induced state, he climbed onto the roof of his former bandmate's car on a highway and screamed, "I am the Temptations." June 1, 1991. David Ruffin was found dead in a limousine in Philadelphia. The driver dumped his body outside a hospital and drove away. No one claimed the body for 3 days. The man with one of the most extraordinary voices in American music history died utterly alone, abandoned not by the world, but by himself. The king of a church, built for darkness, Rick James. 2 words, just 2. That's all Jermaine Jackson needed, pure evil. Not because Rick James killed people, but because he had a gift, rare and almost supernatural, for making others kill their own souls. Summer, 1983. Rick James's Hollywood Hills mansion. The LAPD received an anonymous call about a 3-day party where guests were not being allowed to leave. When officers arrived, they found unconscious bodies around a pool, cocaine smoke, red lights, and in the center of the living room, Rick James, half naked, still performing in a trance. Police filed that incident as the Red Room Ritual. It has never made mainstream news. In 1991, Rick and his girlfriend were charged with kidnapping and torturing a young woman for 3 days. When investigators questioned him about it, Rick James looked them in the eye and said, "That wasn't torture, that was a funk experience." Jermaine said when he heard that quote, something inside him went cold. Because that is not the statement of someone who lost control. That is the statement of someone who genuinely believed they had the right. After 2 years in prison, Rick emerged and said publicly, "I met the devil, and I am him." Jermaine turned off his television and whispered, "No, Rick, you just don't realize the devil already won." August 6, 2004. Rick James found dead in his Burbank apartment. Old posters, pill bottles, Motown vinyls. No one arrived in time. The woman who loved evil, Teena Marie. Every story of destruction has a story of someone who loved the destroyer. Jermaine once said, "There are two kinds of people in Motown, the ones consumed by darkness and the ones who walk into it willingly." Teena Marie was the second kind. She entered Rick's world in 1979, 23 years old, with a voice that sounded like it had been forged in a black church. When she met Rick James in Studio B, she wasn't interested in her recording contract anymore. She was in love. In 1985, at a Motown party in Los Angeles, Jermaine saw Teena again. She was pale, shaking, speaking of Rick in a way that suggested the relationship had not ended, it had metastasized. When someone asked her why she didn't leave, she said simply, "It's his pain, not mine." Jermaine said that was the most terrifying sentence he had ever heard, because it was the voice of someone who had completely surrendered her identity into another person's darkness. After Rick's arrest in 1991, Teena's career collapsed. She kept singing, but the voice trembled. When Rick died in 2004, she stood silently at his casket for an hour, then disappeared from public life. Her neighbors in her final years reported hearing faint singing at 3 a.m., a hoarse voice repeating the same lyric, "Fire and Desire." December 26, 2010, Teena Marie was found dead in her sleep, alone. No one knew exactly when she had passed. Jermaine wrote, "Evil doesn't just kill, it kills the ones who love the evil." The Beauty of Silence, Mary Wilson. Now, we come to a different kind of name. Not someone who committed evil, someone who watched evil happen and said nothing. Mary Wilson was there. She was always there. In 1967, when Florence Ballard was pushed out of the Supremes, Mary was the only person present for both moments, the birth of the group and its collapse. She watched Diana sign the new contract. She watched Florence be escorted out. She heard the door close, and she said nothing. She smiled beside Diana during interviews, nodded along, and for her silence, Motown rewarded her generously. Jermaine once overheard Berry Gordy say, "Mary is the witness, but she'll never open her mouth." In 1986, Mary published her memoir, but when the original manuscript leaked, entire sections were missing. Pages about Diana's private meetings with Gordy, altered contracts, Florence Ballard's last desperate calls for help. Mary said Motown's lawyers had demanded the cuts. Jermaine believed the real reason was simpler. She was afraid. In 1993, during a televised Supremes reunion, Diana hugged Mary on stage and wept before millions. The audience applauded. Backstage, Mary walked to her manager and said, "I feel like I just betrayed Florence again." That line was never broadcast. February 8, 2021. Mary Wilson died in a car accident near Las Vegas. In the trunk, police found a notebook, a draft memoir she'd apparently been writing for years. The title she had given it was one word: confession. Jermaine said, "She didn't kill anyone, but she let the lies live, and that is the hardest sin to cleanse." The Arrogance of Light, Stevie Wonder. Now here is the name that will surprise you the most, because this man has no public scandal, no abuse, no betrayal, no destroyed lives, and yet Jermaine placed him on the list, because there is a kind of darkness that doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from certainty, from a belief so unshakable in one's own divine purpose that everyone around you becomes either a vessel or an obstacle. As Stevie's influence grew through the 1970s, so did his belief that his music was not created. It was transmitted directly through him from God. Musicians who didn't demonstrate the right spiritual energy were dismissed. Engineers began calling these spiritual sessions, recordings where no one was allowed to speak unless Stevie directed them. May 1982, Wonderland Studios, Los Angeles. Jermaine was present. Stevie sat at the center of the room, surrounded by singers standing in complete silence. He said, God is sending the music down. Anyone impure will ruin it." A young female singer quietly asked if she could step out for a moment. Stevie stopped playing and said, "You've let the devil's energy in." The next day, she was removed from the project. Young talents were drawn into Stevie's orbit, fed, mentored, supported, then controlled through promises of being chosen by God. One musician said he was required to write "God is watching" on every sheet of music. No one refused. "I used to admire him," Jermaine said, "until I realized he wasn't singing for God. He was singing to be worshipped." Jermaine called it the arrogance of light, when a person becomes so convinced they have found the truth that they stop seeing the darkness that has quietly surrounded them. The final name, Michael Jackson. And now we reach the name that Jermaine saved for last, the one that took the longest to say, the one that cost him the most, his brother. Michael wasn't a demon in the traditional sense. Jermaine found him something far more haunting, an angel who learned to live in the dark. Michael Jackson was born in 1958 in Gary, Indiana, into a household where a father viewed his sons as a business opportunity above everything else. When the Jackson 5 signed with Motown in 1969, Michael was 11. Gordy and Diana Ross looked at this child and saw exactly what they needed: a face, innocent, magnetic, completely malleable. What the world saw on television, the grinning, effortlessly talented boy, was the product of something Jermaine didn't call training. He called it brainwashing. Behind every televised smile were 14-hour rehearsal days, midnight tapings, threats and humiliations for a single wrong note. Michael was taught from the earliest age that his value was entirely tied to his performance, that love was conditional on output. Diana Ross, appointed his official Motown mentor, shaped him in ways that went far beyond music. She turned the shy, frightened child from Gary into something polished and perfect. But Jermaine watched their relationship with unease, a possessiveness, an attachment neither of them ever fully explained. When Michael was 20, they appeared in Beverly Hills holding hands. The press called it a divine connection. Jermaine used one phrase, a coronation ritual. Even after leaving Motown, Michael couldn't escape the shadows Gordy and Ross had cast over him. He reinvented himself entirely, changed his voice, his face, his skin, erased every visible trace of the child the machine had built. But Jermaine believed Michael was never truly reinventing himself. He was trying to destroy the version of himself that Motown had created. Every time he looked in a mirror, Jermaine said, Michael saw them looking back. At Neverland, former staff described long, strange nights. Michael playing old Motown records alone in darkened rooms, pacing, whispering the names of dead artists. A housekeeper reported that he kept a locked cabinet with photographs of Diana Ross, Gordy, Marvin Gaye, and Rick James, each marked in red ink. When asked why, he said simply, "They're family." During late-night recording sessions, he would ask engineers to cut all the lights, play "I'll Be There," and sit in complete silence for hours. Staff arrived one morning to find him unconscious on the studio floor, surrounded by melted candles. In 1993, the first child abuse allegations broke publicly. The world saw a strange, broken man. Jermaine saw someone who had never learned the difference between love and control, because no one in his life had ever shown him they could be separate. A year before his death, he purchased the original Jackson 5 master recordings, then had them destroyed. Jermaine called it an act of self-exile from history. June 25, 2009. Michael Jackson died at his Holmby Hills home. On his desk, officers found a half-written note. The final line read, "The music stopped talking to me." It wasn't the drugs that killed him. It was the silence that came after a lifetime surrounded by his own voice, his own myth, his own reflection in 1,000 mirrors held up by people who needed something from him. Jermaine called it a holy death, not because Michael was pure, but because he had carried, in his body and his story, every single sin of the Motown empire. The ambition, the control, the desire, the loneliness of being made into a god before you are old enough to understand what that means. The boy who never grew up, the man who never truly lived, the soul that never found peace. When Jermaine Jackson made that list, he wasn't settling scores. He was trying to explain what happens to human beings when they are placed inside a machine that demands everything and gives back only the illusion of love. Diana betrayed to survive. Marvin prayed through sin. Smokey wielded silence like a weapon. Berry Gordy ruled like a god and left behind a graveyard. Rick James turned music into a liturgy of darkness. Teena Marie died for love. Mary Wilson let the lies breathe. Stevie Wonder mistook his light for the only light. And Michael, the culmination of all of them, became the mirror, reflecting everything Motown truly was. Here is the question Jermaine leaves every one of us with. When you listen to those songs today, and you will, because they are undeniably, achingly beautiful, do you hear only the music? Or do you hear the cost? Because someone paid for every note. Someone wept for every melody. Someone sold something that could not be bought back. Motown didn't destroy people with violence. It gave them something far more seductive, the chance to destroy themselves, with fame, with power, with silence, with the overwhelming, intoxicating belief that they were chosen. And if Michael Jackson was the final angel of that empire, then he was also its final proof. Even light, Jermaine said, carries the scent of hell. Drop a comment below. Tell us which Motown story you want us to open next. Subscribe, because the next chapter goes even deeper. And share this with someone who thinks they already know the whole story. They don't.